Welcome to James Madison's Montpelier. I'm Ryan Nobles of NBC 12 in Richmond, and we're continuing our discussion on the Bill of Rights with Peter Irons, who is the political science professor emeritus from UC San Diego and a graduate of Harvard Law, Tim Longo, the chief of police in Charlottesville and an attorney himself, and Stuart Harris, who hosts a weekly public radio show called Your Weekly Constitutional and is on the faculty at Appalachian Law School. One of the things that the government and the military did in particular, perhaps in the wake of Vietnam, is they actually started putting reporters in with battalions in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And do you think, Chief, that this is an effort by the government to manage the news flow that's coming out of these war arenas?
It certainly could be argued to be that. And frankly, I see it somewhat as an unfiltered communication back home to what our troops are dealing with overseas. It's not a report that's a day or 18 hours later. It's live, it's up close, it's personal, and it's unfiltered. Mm-hmm. It's uncensored in many respects.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's a positive development, Stuart, that we see reporters? I mean, reporters are put in with this group of soldiers, but they're not told what they have to report back, correct?
There are some limits that are placed on them. I think the limitation, I might disagree with the chief here a little bit. Certainly there is some direct communication that comes back, but I think most of that is private communication. It's the cell phone cameras and it's the Twitters and the Facebook stuff from the troops. I think that's the subtle control that's being exercised by both Democrats and Republicans. This is a nonpartisan issue. All politicians want to control the press, and I think the way they're doing it is by following that old adage, keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. Mm-hmm. And if you define the press as being your enemy, or somebody at least you want to control, you bring them in, you give them all the supposed access, but you make them indebted to you. Right. You make them identify with the troops, identify with the government, and you lose a lot of that independent spirit that I think made the Vietnam era reporting so incisive.
I mean, they're literally responsible for their safety, right?
Look, when you hang around with a bunch of guys, when you're eating, sleeping with them, you're there 24/7, you're going to have their perspective, okay? And if it's all part of a government sponsorship, I think that can subtly influence coverage.
Administration, whichever administration is in power, they try to develop close relationships with particular news outlets or reporters, give them access, off-the-record briefings, for example. And it's going too far to say that they have bought the press, but they certainly have made it quite clear that if you offend them, if you violate these unwritten or verbally transmitted rules, you are going to be shut out. You're not going to be called on at the press conferences. You're not going to be allowed into the presidential plane to have a off-the-record chat with an official or the president.
Mm-hmm. Chief, nobody's dealing with this on a day-to-day basis more than you. I mean, how do you feel about the access of the press, and do you have any attempts to control the message or control what's coming out of your department? Control might be a strong word, but yeah. I think you know where I'm going.
I think any well-run, efficient organization has a press person or a public information officer, as you've indicated, to make it easier, to make access to that organization a bit easier, because you're not always going to be able to get the CEO. But having said that, there are certain topics and certain things that the public expects the CEO to speak about. And the public expects that CEO, or in my case, chief of police, to be in front of that camera talking with the press about critical issues in their community. But you have to balance that, because you can't be everywhere all the time. But in that balance, never at the expense of sharing information and being candid and forthright, particularly when it comes to things that affect public safety.
All right, very good. Thank you, gentlemen.